Mrs. Frisby and the Rats of Nimh by Robert C. O'Brien. Day 3. The crow must have felt her grow tense, for suddenly from ahead she heard his voice. "An updraft," he said. "We are soaring. There's usually one over this stretch of woods in the evening." A current of warm air rising from the woods was carrying them along. So smooth was the motion that they seemed to stand still, and Mrs. Frisby ventured to open her eyes and lift her head just a trifle. She could not look straight down. That was Jeremy's back. But off to the right, and a bit behind them, she saw a gray-brown square the size of a postage stamp. She realized with a gasp that it was the garden patch, and Martin and Teresa, if they were still there, were too small to be seen. "Look to the left," said Jeremy, who was watching her over his shoulder. She did saw what looked like a wide, fearsome snake, blue-green in color, coiling through the woods. "What is it?" she asked in wonder. "You really don't know? It's the river." "Oh," said Mrs. Frisby, rather ashamed of her ignorance. She had heard of the river, of course, but had not known that it looked like a snake. She had never been there, since to reach it one had to cross the entire width of the forest. There were advantages to being a bird. In a minute more, they had left the updraft, and Jeremy's wings resumed pumping. They went higher, and Mrs. Frisby closed her eyes again. When she opened them, the garden patch had vanished far behind them, and Jeremy, searching the trees below, began a long, slanting descent. Eventually, as he banked sharply, Mrs. Frisby saw off his wingtip a gray-brown patch among a stand of tall, green pines. From so high, it looked like a gnarled gray bush, but as they circled lower, she could see that it was in fact an enormous tree, leafless, skeletal, and partly dead. One huge branch had recently broken off and fallen, and 3 pine trunks lay bent double under its weight. It was a gloomy and primeval spot, deeply shadowed in the gray dusk. Jeremy circled over it one more time, looking at a certain mark 3/4 of the way up the towering main trunk. Just below this spot, another great branch, itself as big as an ordinary tree, jutted out over the tops of the pines, and on this at last Jeremy fluttered gently to rest. They were some 10 feet from the main trunk, and Mrs. Frisby could see, just above the place where the branch joined the tree, a dark round hole, as large as a lunch plate. "We're here," Jeremy said in a low voice. "There's where he lives." "Should I get down?" Instinctively, Mrs. Frisby spoke in a whisper. "Yes, we've got to walk closer, but quietly. He doesn't like loud noises. It's so high." She still clung to the crow's back. "But the limb is broad. You'll be safe enough." And indeed, the limb was almost as wide as a sidewalk. Mrs. Frisby gathered her courage, slithered down, and felt the solid wood under her feet. Still, she could not help thinking about how far it was to the ground below. "There he is," said Jeremy, staring at the hole. "It's just the right time." They inched their way along the limb, Mrs. Frisby gripping the rough bark tightly, being careful not to stumble, and as they came closer she could dimly perceive a shape like a squat vase sitting back in the hollow of the tree. Near the top of the vase, wide apart, 2 round yellow eyes glowed in the dark. "He can't see us," Jeremy whispered. "It's still too light." Perhaps not, but he could hear, for now a deep round voice, a voice like an organ tone, echoed out of the hollow trunk. "Who is standing outside my house?" Jeremy answered, "Sir, I am a crow. My name is Jeremy, and I have brought a friend. I hope we have not disturbed you. My friend needs your advice." "I see. And can your friend not speak for himself?" "Sir, my friend is a lady mouse." "A mouse?" The sonorous voice sounded unbelieving. "Why should a crow be a friend to a mouse? I was trapped, sir, and she set me free. She saved me from the cat." "That is possible," said the owl, "though unusual. I have heard of such a thing before. We all help one another against the cat." "True. And now, sir, my friend here herself is in trouble." "I understand," said the owl, moving closer to the round entrance of his hollow. "Mrs. Mouse, I cannot see you, for the glare of the daylight is too bright. But if you will step inside my house, I will listen to what you have to say." Mrs. Frisby hesitated. She knew something of the dietary habits of owls, and she did not like the idea of being trapped in his house. Finally, she said timidly, "Sir, I would not want to intrude, and I can hear you quite well from out here. Mrs. Mouse, please understand that I have no interest at all, as a general rule, in helping mice to solve their problems. If you have indeed saved a bird from the cat, I will spare you a few minutes. But I do not discuss problems with people I cannot see. Either come inside or tell your friend to take you home again." Behind her, Mrs. Frisby heard Jimmy whisper very softly, "It's all right. He wouldn't harm you in his own home." She whispered back, "I hope not." She walked up the limb to the hollow, climbed over the sill, and stepped inside. Up so close the owl looked very large. Each of his feathery feet was tipped with 5 gleaming talons, an inch long. His beak was curved and sharp and cruel. He blinked his yellow eyes and said, "Please step across the room, away from the light." Mrs. Frisby did as she was told. As she grew accustomed to the dimness, she looked around her. The chamber into which she had stepped was spacious. At that level, almost half of the huge trunk was hollow and clean, but the floor was extremely rough. It was not really a floor at all, but only the jagged ends of dead wood sticking up from below, like stalagmites in a cave, so that Mrs. Frisby had to climb rather than walk as she crossed the room. In the back, the walls narrowed to a corner, and there she saw that the owl had built himself a nest, as big as a water bucket, of twigs and leaves. From the top she could see protruding some wisps of feathers with which he had lined it. She got near this nest. She stopped and faced the owl, who had turned from the light to the doorway and was peering at her with his great yellow eyes. Jeremy was nowhere to be seen. She could only hope he was still waiting on the limb outside. "Now," said the owl, "you may state your problem. Go to the rats." Mrs. Frisby began nervously, trying to arrange her thoughts. "It's about my youngest son, Timothy. He is sick, too sick to leave his bed, and moving day is only 5 days off." "Wait," said the owl. "Moving from where?" "Moving to where?" "From the garden patch, where we are living, to the edge of the pasture by the stream." "Which garden?" It had not occurred to Mrs. Frisby until now that a bird flying freely over miles of countryside would look down on many gardens. "It belongs to Mr. Fitzgibbon." "The one with the large stone?" "Yes, my house is near the stone." "What makes you so sure moving day will come in 5 days?" Mrs. Frisby told him about the tractor, and what Mr. Fitzgibbon had said, 5 days until plowing. Of course, she added, it might turn cold again, and freeze, or even snow. "No," said the owl, sounding quite sure, "it will not. The wild onions are already up in the pastures." He asked her then what kind of house she had, and exactly where it was in relation to the big stone. Apparently, he knew the spot well. But the more she talked to him, the more Mrs. Frisby became convinced that he would produce no solution to her problem. It had been foolish of her to think he could, foolish of her to come at all, because, she thought, there really was no solution. At last she fell silent, and the owl asked no more questions. Finally he said, "Lying where it does, your house will inevitably be turned up by the plow, and probably broken to bits in the process. There is no feasible way to prevent this. My only advice to you is this. If you stay in the house, you will surely be crushed and killed, all of you. Therefore, it is better to take your chances with moving. Wrap your son Timothy up as warmly as you can, help him as much as possible on the journey, and hope for warm weather on moving day. That way you are at least sure to save yourself and the other children." The owl paused, turned away from her, and looked again at the entrance to his hollow. The patch of light it admitted was growing steadily dimmer. "And now, if you will excuse me, the night is falling, and I have no more time to spare. I regret that I cannot give you a more satisfactory solution to your problem. Good evening, Mrs. He paused. "I don't believe you told me your name." "Mrs. Frisby." The poor mouse spoke with a sob in her throat, for the owl had said exactly what she feared he would say. And she had no real hope for Timothy. The owl had said, in effect, either Timothy alone must die, or they must all die together. If moving day should be extraordinarily warm, the nights were sure to be frosty, and that would be the end of him. Still, one must be polite, and she added sadly, "I thank you, sir, for listening to me." But at the mention of her name, an extraordinary change had come over the owl. He turned back to face her again and stared at her most intently. Indeed, he gave an agitated flutter of his wings and half flew, half hopped closer to her, bending forward until his great sharp beak was only a few inches from her face. Mrs. Frisby shrank back in fear. What had she done wrong? "Did you say Mrs. Frisby?" "Yes, you asked my name." "Related to Jonathan Frisby?" "Yes, he was my husband. He died last summer. He was Timothy's father. But how did you know about him?" "That is not important," said the owl, drawing back a little and looking at her in a new way, almost as if with deference. "I will say this, his name was not unknown in these woods, and if you are his widow, that puts matters in a different light." Something in the way he said this caused Mrs. Frisby's hopes to lift a little. "What do you mean?" she asked. "I mean, madame, that there is a way that your son's life might just possibly be saved. I did not mention it to you because I saw no way you could conceivably do it, and I did not want to arouse false hope. But if you are Jonathan Frisby's widow, then perhaps it can be done." "I don't understand at all," said Mrs. Frisby. "What is this thing?" "It is not a thing that I can do myself. You must go to the rats." "To the rats? But I don't know any rats. They have nothing to do with me." I don't doubt that. They have little to do with anyone except themselves, and will have less as time goes on. Nonetheless, I think they will help you, and if they will, they can. But what can they do? They must move your house to a place where it will be safe from the plow. Now Mrs. Frisby's spirits fell again, and she said almost bitterly, "You are joking, sir. You are not serious. No rat could move my house. It is far too heavy, much too big. The rats on Mr. Fitzgibbon's farm have things, ways, you know nothing about. They are not like the rest of us. They are not, I think, even like most other rats. They work at night, in secret. Mrs. Frisby, do you know their main entrance? In the rose bush. Yes. Go there. You will find a sentry guarding the door. His name is Justin. Tell him who you are, and that you come at my request. Tell him that you want to see a rat named Nicodemus. I think they will let you in, though they may insist on swearing you to secrecy. If they should ask that, you must, of course, use your own judgment, but my advice would be to do as they ask." Mrs. Frisby was close to complete bewilderment. "Secrecy," she said. "Secrecy about what?" "That I cannot reveal. I, too, have agreed to it. Also, there is much I do not know, though I have given advice on certain aspects of their projects." "Well," said Mrs. Frisby, "I don't understand it all, but if it might save Timothy, I will try to do what you say. Tell them," added the owl, "that I suggest moving the house into the lee of the stone. Remember that, the lee of the stone. Also, do not forget the names, Justin and Nicodemus." "Justin, Nicodemus, the lee of the stone," repeated Mrs. Frisby. "I will remember." She was now so entirely puzzled that she did not think to ask what the phrase meant. Presumably, the rats would know. "And, Mrs. Frisby," said the owl, moving again toward the entrance to the hollow, "please understand, I was an admirer of your late husband, though I never met him in person. I wish you well. I hope your son's life can be saved. You see, I can understand your particular need, for I face a similar problem." "You?" said Mrs. Frisby. "But you have no moving day." "I have lived in this tree, in this same hollow," the owl said, "for more years than anyone can remember. But now, when the wind blows hard in winter and rocks the forest, I sit here in the dark, and from deep down in the bole, down near the roots, I hear a new sound. It is the sound of strands of wood creaking in the cold and snapping one by one. The limbs are falling. The tree is old, and it is dying. Yet I cannot bring myself, after so many years, to leave, to find a new home and move into it, perhaps to fight for it. I, too, have grown old. One of these days, one of these years, the tree will fall, and when it does, if I am still alive, I will fall with it." With this sad prediction, the owl stepped through his doorway, spread his great wings, and was gone, soaring silently downward into the shadowy woods below. Mrs. Frisby followed him out onto the limb. To her relief, Jeremy was still waiting where she had left him, though not very patiently. "We must hurry," he said. "It's almost dark. I'm not supposed to be out so late." Mrs. Frisby, who had the same feeling, climbed on his back, much less afraid now, for two reasons. First, she was getting used to air travel. Second, since the woods below them were dark, she could no longer see how far away the ground was. "He talked to you for a long time," said Jeremy, as they flew. "Did he tell you anything that will help?" "I don't know," said Mrs. Frisby. Since the owl had brought up the matter of secrecy, and had, in fact, been secretive himself, she was not sure just how much she should tell Jeremy. "Why don't you know?" "I mean, he told me some things, but I don't know whether they'll help or not." She decided to counter with a question of her own. "What does 'in the lee' mean?" Jeremy, being like all birds knowledgeable about the wind, knew the answer to that. "It means the calm side, the side the wind doesn't blow from. When there's a strong wind, you fly up to the barn from the lee, so you don't get bashed into the wall. My father taught me that." "I see," said Mrs. Frisby, and she became more puzzled than ever. What had the wind to do with it? "He told me," she said finally, deciding it could do no harm, to go and see the rats." "The rats?" Jeremy was startled. "But they don't have anything to do with us." "I know, but he thought they might help." "What could they do?" "He thought they might move my whole house." "But how could they do it? I can't imagine." "Oh, I don't doubt that they could," said Jeremy. "Everyone knows, at least all the birds know, that the rats can do things. They're up to something. Nobody's quite sure what. For one thing, they're building themselves a new house, way back in the woods, over the mountains. They've even made quite a big clearing near it. I'd show you, but it's too dark now. They used to carry food, like the rest of us, but now we see them with other things, pieces of metal and bits of machinery and things I can't even recognize. They take them into that rose bush, and whatever happens to them, I don't know. But the owl knows more than most. I expect he's had some dealings with them. Just the same, I've never heard of their helping anybody but themselves. Neither have I, but I'm going to ask them anyway. There isn't anyone else to ask. By the time they reached the garden, it had gone almost completely dark, and Jeremy could not linger. "Good night, Jeremy," said Mrs. Frisby, feeling almost affectionate toward the crow. "Thank you for taking me, and for waiting to bring me back." "You're welcome," said Jeremy. "If you need me again, just ask. After all, if it weren't for you, I wouldn't be here to ask." And he flew off into the darkness, the last crow to get home that night. In the rose bush. When Mrs. Frisby got home, Teresa, Martin, and Cynthia were eating supper, as she had told them to do if it got dark before she returned. Coming silently down the tunnel, she could hear them talking in the room below, and she paused a moment to eavesdrop on their conversation. Obviously, Cynthia had been worrying, and Teresa was reassuring her. "She couldn't have got back sooner than this, Cindy. Don't you remember? The crow said it was a mile to the tree. It might even be farther." "Yes, but crows fly so fast." "But if he went 2 miles high," that was Martin, "it would be 3 miles altogether." "6, said Teresa. 2 up, 2 down, and 1 to get there, and 1 to get back." "That's right. No wonder she isn't back yet. But how about the owl? You know how owls are." It was light. It was still light when they got there. He couldn't see. "But it's dark now," said Cynthia. "Oh, I wish she'd come back. I'm scared." "Not so loud," Teresa said. "Timothy will hear." "I'm home," called Mrs. Frisby, hurrying the rest of the way down. And now it appeared that they had all been worried, for they ran to her, and even Martin, who ordinarily avoided such displays, threw his arms around her. "Oh, Mother," cried Cynthia, near tears. "I was so worried." "Poor Cynthia, it's all right." "How high did you fly?" asked Martin, recovering quickly. "High enough so the trees looked like bushes, the garden like a postcard, and the river like a snake." "Did you see the owl? What did he say?" "I saw him. Later I'll tell you about it. First I want to see Timothy." "How is he? Why didn't you move his bed out here?" Teresa said, "I wanted to, but he said he'd rather stay in the bedroom. I think he's feeling worse again." But when Mrs. Frisby went to see him, she found him sitting up, and his forehead felt not at all feverish. "I'm all right," he said. "I stayed in here because I wanted to think about something." "Think about what?" "About moving day." "Moving day? But why? What about it?" Had he, after all, overheard her talking to the others? Heard about her flight to the owl? But no, he was explaining. "I haven't been outdoors since I got sick, so I don't know what it's like. I mean the weather, but today, this afternoon, I noticed something." "What was that?" "A smell in the air, a warm, wet smell. If you sniff, you can still smell it, though it's not so strong now." Mrs. Frisby had noticed this, of course, both indoors and out. "It's the smell of the frost melting," Timothy went on. "I remember it from last year. And after that, it wasn't long until we moved. Mother, when are we going to move this year?" "Oh, not for a long time yet." Mrs. Frisby tried to sound as casual as she could. "It's still much too cold, too early to think about it." "I have to think about it," said Timothy. He sounded serious, but calm and unworried. "Because if it comes too soon, I don't know if I can go. I tried walking a little bit today, in here, when the others were outside." "Timothy, you're supposed to stay in bed. You'll make yourself sick again." I know, but I had to find out. And I didn't walk much. I couldn't. I only went a few steps, and I got so dizzy I had to lie down again." "Of course you did. You haven't really recovered yet." "I guess I haven't. That's why I wanted to think. Timothy, you must not worry about it. That will only make you worse." "I'm not worried at all. I thought I would be, but I'm not. Or maybe I think I should be, but I can't. What I really think about is how nice it is there, in the summer, beside the brook, and it's true, I want to go. But I'm not scared. I was afraid you might be, or that you might think I was. That's really what I wanted to tell you. I'm just going to wait and see what happens. So you shouldn't worry about it either." Mrs. Frisby realized that he had somehow switched their positions. He had seen the danger he was in, guessed somehow that moving day was near, and that he was very likely to die. And yet, here he was, reassuring her. She wanted to tell him about the owl and the rats, tell him that something still might be done, but she decided she had better not. She did not really know if they would help. It would be better to wait until she had seen them. So instead she said, rather lamely, "Timothy, don't think about it any more. When the time comes, we'll see how you are, and then decide what to do." The next morning, at daybreak, she went to see the rats. She had never been in the rosebush before, never even really close to it, and now the nearer she got, the more nervous she became. No one had ever told her, nor, as far as she knew, told any of the other animals to keep away from it. It was just something one knew. The rats on Mr. Fitzgibbon's farm kept to themselves. One did not prowl in their domain. She had, before coming out of the garden, looked around carefully to be sure Dragon was nowhere in sight. But even Dragon, though he would chase a rat up to the edge of the bush, would not follow him into it. The thorns, of course, helped to discourage trespassers. Mrs. Frisby had never realized until that moment, standing next to it, how very big the bush was, how dense, how incredibly thorny. It was bigger than the tractor shed, and its branches were so densely intertwined that, as small as she was, Mrs. Frisby could find no easy way to crawl into it, though she walked all the way around it, looking. She remembered approximately where she had seen the rats go in, and she studied that part of the bush carefully. How had they done it? Then she saw that on one branch close to the ground, the thorns had been scraped off, and about a half-inch of it, just big enough for a handhold, was worn smooth. She put her hand on this and pushed timidly. The branch yielded easily, rather like a swinging door, and behind it she saw a trail, a sort of tunnel, through the bush, wide enough so that she could walk into it without touching thorns on either side. When she went forward, she released the branch, and it swung back silently into place behind her. She was inside the bush, and it was dark. She walked forward, peering into the dimness, and following the small trail which wound in a curving course toward the center of the bush, its earthen floor packed firm by the pressure of small feet. Then straight ahead of her, she saw the entrance. She had expected, what? A round hole in the dirt? Most likely, but certainly nothing like what she saw. First, a sizable clearing, about 5 feet across, had been cut from the center of the bush. Branches overhead had been cleared away too, not quite to the top of the bush, but almost, so that the sunlight filtered through easily, and soft moss grew on the ground. In the middle of this bright green cave rose a small mound, 8 inches tall, in the end of which had an arched entrance, neatly lined with stone, like a small doorway without any door. Behind the entrance, a tunnel, its floor also lined with stones, led backward and downward. Beside the entranceway, looking at her with dark, unblinking eyes, stood the biggest rat she had ever seen. Brutus. Stop where you are, said the rat. How did you get in here? I walked in, said Mrs. Frisby, keeping her voice calm with an effort. I found a branch with the thorn smoothed off. I pushed it back and found... I know, said the rat rather rudely. And now, walk out again. You aren't allowed in here. He moved a few inches toward her, placing himself between her and the entrance. She noticed how powerful his muscles looked under his glossy coat. He would almost be a match for Dragon. Almost, but not quite. Go on, he repeated. But I have a reason. I don't care what you have. Go away. You're small. I wouldn't want to hurt you. Are you Justin? Mrs. Frisby inched back as the rat inched forward. I'm Brutus. Justin's not here. That was reasonably obvious, Mrs. Frisby thought. The rat named Brutus added, You know Justin? No, said Mrs. Frisby. That is, not exactly. If you don't know him, how do you know his name? Brutus sounded puzzled, and Mrs. Frisby observed that although he was greatly oversized and muscular, and his eyes were bright enough, he looked very young. It was told to me by a friend. Can I see him? Justin? No. He's at a meeting. I'm taking his place. They're all at a meeting, but me. Bad luck, thought Mrs. Frisby. He's a substitute. She said, Then I'll wait for him. No, said Brutus, you can't stay here. I've got orders. Now go, or I'll have to take you out myself. He moved forward again. My name, said the mouse desperately, is Mrs. Jonathan Frisby. I want to see Nicodemus. It did not work. I don't care what your name is, and you can't see Nicodemus, that's sure. Brutus now looked both puzzled and annoyed. Move on and be quick. All right, said Mrs. Frisby. You needn't force me. I'll go. She turned slowly and walked back the way she had come. She felt like crying. After coming all this way, after flying to see the owl, to be turned back so abruptly at the end. She thought as she walked into the darker part of the bush, maybe she could just wait for an hour or so until the meeting, what kind of meeting could it be, was over, and then go back, and perhaps the rat named Justin would be at the entrance then. But would Justin pay any more attention to her than Brutus had done? She had a feeling that he would. But when she stopped, she heard footsteps behind her. She looked back and saw that Brutus was following her, so she started again, hurrying to keep out of his sight. After a while, she paused again and listened. This time there was no sound. He must have gone back to his post. She sat down on the ground. Then ahead of her, in the direction of the place where she had entered the bush, she heard a rustle, a faint scraping noise. It was the branch she had pushed to get in. Someone else was moving it. Someone was coming in, walking along the narrow path toward her. It must be another rat. Suddenly she was terrified. What would he do, meeting her unexpectedly in this dimness? She shrank to one side, as close as she could get to the wall of thorns, hoping that whoever it was might go on past, not seeing her. Then he came around the curve. and she saw him. It was her old friend, Mr. Ages, the white mouse. He was moving extremely slowly, and she realized that he was limping badly. One of his legs was injured. It was wrapped up in splints and bandaged. Mr. Ages, she called softly. It's Mrs. Frisby. Who? He peered into the shadow. I can't see you. Mrs. Frisby. She moved into the middle of the path in front of him.